so, one of the reasons that you're sitting here today, one of the reasons that I know you is that despite all that darkness that you got sucked into, you somehow, in some way, at some point, realized that you were going in the wrong direction, and you turned around and started to. And I know we've talked about it before. It wasn't like you woke up one day and said, "Today I'm going to change my life." You transitioned. You transformed over a period of time. You can't put you're not going to put a day on it. You didn't have a eureka moment, but you slowly started seeing yourself from a different perspective and realizing that the path you were on wasn't a good one.
So as soon as I graduated high school, I left to start working on ranches. I went to Montana, and I remember clearly I was 18, I guess, and I was working on a ranch in Montana, and someone had left laying around this dusty old copy of D.H. Lawrence's book of poetry. And I read this little poem, and it just stuck with me. And I'll read it here. It's, "I never saw a wild thing sorry for itself. A small bird will drop frozen dead from a bough without ever having felt sorry for itself." And I read those words, and they just hit me in the right place. And I'm not saying that in particular is what really started to make a change, but I read some more things, and I was growing older, and I was thinking about things differently, and my abuser had died, and that was probably the biggest weight that I've ever felt lifted off of me. Because now what I realized is, even if I did choose to tell someone, it wasn't going to cause the kind of scene that it would have before. Now, I still didn't really choose to tell anyone, but that in itself, not having him actually be present, was a big thing for me. And I realized that I'd just been damaging myself, and I'd really been hurting people in my life. My parents, my sister, they were just confused. They didn't understand why I was doing what I was doing to myself. And I realized that I was just I was being selfish and self-centered and just feeling sorry for myself. And I stopped. I just gained a little bit of perspective and made myself stop.
That perspective piece is so important. What's crazy, and I know we all have seen, and everyone's seen, people that are in the downward spiral. They're just caught in the downward spiral, whether it's a relationship, whether it's booze, whether it's drugs, whether it's behavior. You can see it. And when you're on the outside of it, it's so obvious. And you want to grab that person. And I'm sure everyone, I have literally grabbed my friends that I've seen in that downward spiral and shaking them and saying, "Get out, come here. All you have to do is come over here, step over here with me, and look back and see what situation you're in and the direction you're heading." Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, you can't pull them out. You can't pull their head out and let them look back at themselves. They have to step out. They have to come to that recognition themselves. And that's one of the hardest things as a friend or as a family member, to watch that person. It's like watching a train wreck. And all you could do, you could press the brakes. You realize how easy it would be to just, hey, press the brakes, stop.
Yeah.
And yet we can't do it. We can't help people. We can't. Yeah. You have to help yourself. And so, I mean, obviously, that poem, seeing that was a form of you starting to take a look at it, starting to take a look at yourself from a different perspective. Maybe your abuser dying helped you start to look at that from a different perspective.
Definitely. It was a long, slow process for me, though. It didn't just happen overnight. I mean, I think I've made a very conscious decision not to hurt myself anymore, but you have to teach yourself how to think and feel. And that takes time to teach yourself to have the right kind of thoughts and feelings about things. And one thing that I wanted to say while I'm here talking about this is that just because I'm sitting here saying that I did this, that I woke up and stopped, doesn't mean that everyone who's experienced something like this should just get over it. If you have listeners, if you have a girlfriend or a wife or a sister or someone who has been through something like this, or maybe after listening to this show will confess to you that they've been through something like this. Maybe they've never told you before. And maybe they'll tell you something that doesn't even seem like that big of a deal. Maybe it's not years and years of abuse or violence. Maybe it is something that, happened to them when they were young, and it's a sucky situation, but it's not horrible. It's not horrific. But she still feels violated. And it's this personal process that you have to go through. And friends and family and people that know someone is struggling with this definitely need to support in every way they can. But you also don't become a crutch. Just because someone has gone through something like this doesn't give them the right to drag everyone else down with them into their pit of depression and misery. So you support the best you can without enabling the bad behavior, because that's really what it is. It's bad behavior. There's people who've gone through much more horrific things than anything I have ever been through that have come out fine. And it's just getting your mind in the right place and taking control of your thoughts.
And I know, you have obviously experience being married to a military member, and I would say along the lines of what you just said is that people are going to handle things differently. And you can have two guys that were on the same exact combat deployment and did, pretty much the same things, and they're just going to have to deal with it in a different way. Mm. And maybe one guy gets over it pretty quick, or maybe one guy barely even reacts to it. Maybe one guy, it really hurts him and it takes him some time, and it sounds like it's the same thing with what you're saying. We have to be open to, hey, this may take some time and it may take a different course. And at the exact, again, to mirror what you just said, there's guys that just because they had some rough combat, that doesn't give them the right to, number one, drag themselves down the wrong path, and number two, drag their family and their friends down the wrong path. And I think definitely, saying, hey, look, I don't claim to understand what you've been through, but I do know this. Your behavior is not going to help it, right? The bottle isn't going to help it. The self-abuse isn't going to help it. The skipping work isn't going to help it. So I think those are fairly similar. Again, I'm not trying to say they're the same thing. I'm just saying that that dealing with them has a lot of similarities. Both guys that have been in combat trauma and people that have suffered this type of abuse. It seems like there's some similarities in the way that there's varied ways that they get handled. There
always has to be accountability for your own actions, no matter what you've been through. You can't just say, I've been through something horrible, so I can act like this.
Well, case in point, before we pressed record today, you and I were talking about, Colonel Reeder, who came on the show and who was a POW. And
he was amazing.
And you just think that guy, just has been through, and he's been through hell, and then he sits there during the podcast and says the same thing that you just said, which is, look, I had it rough, but there's plenty of guys that had it way worse than me. And you know, I can't think of anything worse than a 2-foot tall bamboo cage in the middle of the jungle with rats eating my wounds, with my feet shackled into a bamboo shackle. You know, that's just unbelievable. And to your point, he comes on and says, you know, number one, other people have had it rougher than me, and number two, I'm happy for what I've got, and let's move forward.
Yeah. So it really wasn't until my kids were born that, I mean, this was in my mind all the time. I would say into my mid-20s, this is how prevalent it was. I probably thought about the abuse at least once every single day. It was always in my mind. And eventually I learned that I didn't need to waste my thoughts on that and learned to spend less time thinking about it. But it really wasn't until my kids were born, I think, and my daughter was 5 years old. She was just this little girl, and she was the same age that I was when I was already dealing with abuse. And that just made me burn with rage. And I realized that I felt that I had an obligation to speak about this. That it happens to so many kids. It's so prevalent in not, girls, but also boys. It's not just girls. It happens in higher number to girls, but it happens to both. And I felt like what I'd been through and what I had, I think I've come around and am a pretty well-adjusted person now, and that I had an obligation to talk about this because it's something that doesn't get talked about. It gets swept under the rug, and even people who have happened to get treated like there's something wrong with them, and they're embarrassed and they don't want to talk about it. And it's time for that to stop. It's time for us to start talking about it. And I feel like I'm resilient. I grew up with this really close proximity to nature, and I've seen animals suffer horrific wounds that should kill them. They don't have doctors, they don't have medicine, but they've got fire in their hearts and they don't feel sorry for themselves, and they survive. And I credit a lot of my resiliency to my upbringing in nature and observation of nature, and how it's cruel and it's beautiful. And creatures survive in the most difficult and challenging situations, and they flourish. And if they can do that, so can I.
That's awesome. That is just awesome. And